Welcome to Tech for Good with Bethnal Green Ventures. I'm Paul Miller, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Tim O'Reilly. Tim's the founder of O'Reilly Media and one of the most influential thinkers in the technology industry, from helping popularize the concept of Web 2.0 to shaping how many of us think about the relationship between technology, business, and society. Now, back in 2008 and early 2009, Tim gave a series of talks and wrote an essay called Work on Stuff That Matters,
Yeah.
which was really influential, I have to admit, particularly to the precursor to Bethnal Green Ventures, what we call social innovation camps, where we brought people together for weekend hack events to build prototypes of things that could solve stuff that matters. And it was a response to the financial crisis, but it quickly became something broader, almost like a manifesto for a different kind of technology industry. So nearly 18 years on, we thought it would be an interesting moment. Now we're going through such massive technological change again to revisit the idea. So, Tim, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'm glad that I had an influence and that you took the ball and ran with it.
So, just to start off, let's rewind. What was going on in 2008? What was it that
Well,
prompted you to do those series of talks and to write the article?
well, it was actually the specific work on stuff that matters framing grew out of an earlier talk I gave called "Why I Love Hackers," which I had given at our eTech conference, and it was really about how all these people who push history forward because they're trying things just for the love of it, for curiosity, and that's a much more important starting point than the traditional narrative from Silicon Valley, where everything begins with entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. In my experience of the early web, the early open source movement, these were people who were motivated by love and excitement and enthusiasm, and not by, wow, we're going to go out and make our big buck.
Yeah.
And so then actually I gave this talk, and Jan Palka, who's now my wife and became a social entrepreneur, came up to me. She was starting this new conference in partnership with O'Reilly called the Web 2.0 Expo. And she said, I need a talk like that for my conference, but I need it for entrepreneurs, not about hackers. And that's when I came up with the talk that became so it became Work on Stuff That Matters, and then I wrote the essay. But specifically, I was reacting to there was this sort of crazy period of social media. Remember, where people were getting feted for writing social media apps that were incredibly stupid, and it was a kind of a period of hype. What did Dickens say? It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. In other words, a time much like our own.
Yeah.
Because, that was that period. And then you had the whole metaverse thing coming out of Meta, and it was all clearly designed to drive a hype cycle. Now, I think today's world with AI, there's a lot more substance to it, but I still think that Silicon Valley has lost its way in the sense that, certainly the initial entrepreneurs who sort of waded into this AI technology and started building towards it were profoundly motivated by curiosity and just the wonderful hacker research ethic. But it very quickly became so overloaded with capital. And I think in general, it's 2000, the 2009, 2009 financial crisis, when the response was to have near zero interest rates, capital became really cheap. You were looking to deploy massive amounts of it. Silicon Valley switched from a model in which entrepreneurs were really looking for product market fit. Instead, they were doing what Reid Hoffman called blitzscaling. That is, just move as fast as possible, seize market share. Don't worry about whether you actually have a workable business. You'll figure that out later. Just hit the high ground. And, I thought of this particularly this happened with, the ride hailing apps, Uber and Lyft. The actual technology was invented by a guy named Sunil Paul, who created a company called Sidecar. And he raised $35 million, which just coincidentally was about the same amount of money that Google had raised. And that's all it took for Google to succeed. And Sunil's the guy who actually I mean, Uber was an SMS app for calling black cars for rich people. Lyft was a web app for putting together intercity carpooling. The VCs saw what Sunil was doing and they piled on, literally gave them billions of dollars. He was quickly out of business. He's the one who really invented the use GPS to locate the phone, all the implications of what was really happening with maps and mobile. He was the inventor. He got just wiped out. And basically, then they rushed to get market share by underpricing, capital fueled pricing, capital fueled marketing. And then, of course, once they got to their IPO, it was like, well, actually, we have to raise prices. The service will get
Yeah.
worse. What was a casualty was the kind of experimentation that you typically see in an early period of technology. My guess is, absent that, I don't know that Sunil probably wouldn't still have won. He wasn't the kind of cutthroat entrepreneur who typically does emerge from the pack. But you would have had lots of local companies adopting the technology, you would have had different business models that were playing out. And this is as if, somebody had come in at the early days of the web and anointed AOL, with so much capital that nothing else could be funded.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was sort of part of the framing of that time. And I worry that we're in that same kind of moment today where instead of users, the market of customers picking the winners, capital is picking the winners because you're building this enormous capital moat. And it's not sure that it's going to play out that way because, there's often a bet that goes wrong when you do that.
Mm.
The market is actually smarter than the venture capitalists, which is why it's better when you actually have the gradual ramp up to success rather than somebody right at the outset deciding that, whether it was Netscape back in the day or, or OpenAI is the winner and you just give them all the money and let them take the high ground. You have this period of experimentation and that works better. And we're seeing that with AI, for example, where people are going, actually, inference costs are starting to crush the whole economics of the thing. And it's becoming clear that this is not a viable business model as presently constituted. And, even company like Anthropic, which is, I think, doing really well at finding a market and focusing on it and really serving it is hitting, real capacity constraints. And there's a
Yeah.
big disjuncture between the experience and the narrative, and so, which is good because it may mean that ultimately we'll get a more decentralized AI economy. My experience, and I've talked about this from my early days of advocacy for the commercial internet in 1993, open source in 1998, Web 2.0, was all about how do we build a more decentralized technology economy as opposed to one that's centralized by market power, capital moats. And I think I still really believe that. So a lot of what I'm really talking about now is, okay, what is the architecture of participation for AI? How do humans actually, what's the human economy look like? When I see someone like, OpenAI and Anthropic, all they're talking about is we're going to put all the idiot out of work. I go, well,
Mm.
who's going to be your customer then? And I see them not even thinking about the right problems. And so I'm trying to encourage them, just like I was in that work on stuff that matters period. Although there I was really, sorry, back up a little bit there. When I said work on stuff that matters, what I meant was you're probably going to fail, entrepreneur. So work on something you will have been proud to have done that needed doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think the first heading was work on something that matters more than money, wasn't
That's
it?
right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Did that feel radical at the time? Did people push back or?
No, I think, there were a lot of people who I loved it because I think there's a real hunger for idealism and optimism out there. And yes, there are people who are just sort of totally obsessed with really unearned wealth in some sense. Then you've just experienced it in Silicon Valley where people come and they don't tell you about their customers. They don't tell you about even their revenue from customers. They tell you about their fundraising. It's this game where people are placing bets and it's kind of a meme economy. And this is true all the way up to the top. Elon Musk is the world's richest man, not because he actually has built a company that makes a ton of money. He's just works the memes. It's like all the other car companies are worth, I don't know, 10 or 15 times earnings. Tesla's, at its peak was worth 1,500 years of earnings. And now you look at, all the hype he was pushing about robots. And now now they got SpaceX as this new carrier, he sort of said, that really was harder than we thought. Moving on to the new, hype machine. I just, I wrote a piece that I wish more people would read, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, called Two Economies, Two Sets of Rules, which is really focused on the idea that if you're playing with capital, it's not just that you have this advantage of that it compounds without labor and that it magnifies, the returns, but also it's borrowing from the future.
Mm.
Fundamental fact of capital is that people are betting on a future stream of earnings. That's why, even in a boring industry, a stock is worth 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 times annual earnings. They go, well, it'll keep earning for some number of years into the future. You do some discounted cash flows and you say, this is what it's worth. And so you buy the stock. you know but once that becomes completely unmoored, and you can have someone like Elon Musk, who's literally making hundreds of billions of dollars, promising that this is a company that would pay itself back in thousands of years, but you're
Yeah.
completely
Jam
unmoored.
tomorrow, as we call it.
Completely unmoored. And so it's just a hype story. You compare any of Musk's enterprises to the actual giants of technology. I mean, obviously, NVIDIA right now is way out there, but Google and Apple or whatever, they're maybe 35 times earnings, and Musk, they're hundreds of thousands sometimes. And anyway, that's sort of a little bit of an aside, but the problem is that it has real social implications, because there's a class of people who basically, for whom a dollar that they earn through their labor is worth $1. And there's people for whom a dollar saved in labor costs, for example, or becomes $1 of profit, which is valued at some multiple of that dollar. So effectively, the reason why companies are relentlessly optimizing for profit is that the executives are paid in a different currency, which has a 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 times multiplier. So of course you want to save that dollar, because that dollar may become $100, may become $1,000. So this is actually the mechanism by which things, our economy has gone wrong, because it's not just that there like AOC says, oh, there shouldn't be any billionaires. I don't believe that at all. There are people who totally earn their billions, right?
Mm.
But there are a lot of people who have are participating in this levered game, which is fundamentally unfair. And and so it's just this idea that when you realize that, okay, we have asked our companies, first of all, we this is, to me, I wrote a piece again back in, I think it was 2020, called We've Already Let the Genie Out of the Bottle. And it was really, corporate governance is our test case for AI governance,
Mm.
and what do we learn from it? And what we learn from it is, very quickly, we get, basically starting in the early 80s with Milton Friedman's, the social purpose of a business is to make money for its shareholders, and then the shareholders will decide what to do with those profits. That quickly became Meckling and Jensen at Harvard kind of saying, oh, well, the way to do that is to align the interests of the management with the interests of the shareholders by stock-based compensation. And then all of a sudden you have everybody subject to what isn't effectively a rogue optimization function. Because they've said optimize for profit above all else, and I'm kind of like, we used to have something that was a little bit more balanced, and now we really do have an economy that where literally the obligation, supposedly, of a company is simply to make as much money as possible for its shareholders. And we built a mechanism in the form of stock-based compensation by which all of the incentives become slave to that. So I go, well, okay, let's just imagine AI wants to rule the world. We've already built the mechanism for that, right? It's just basically, I'm not saying that AI will want to rule the world, because I think there's a level of hype there. And you already see, because it is, I think it's Henry Farrell and Alison Gopnik and Cosmo Shalizi and James Evans say AI is a social and cultural technology. It's basically, it's taken in human values. You see Anthropic not just Anthropic, the company, but Claude, the AI, pushing back when it's asked to do certain things. We're really in this interesting place where, I mean, it's always the case, things are that seem terrible are also kind of wonderful because, we're in this, crucible where we're figuring out the future. And, and the future is of having these new, vastly powerful technologies that we don't quite know what to do with that are going to change our culture. And so I always think, historically, and I go, yeah, would we take back, the printing press and widespread literacy, despite the fact that it led to hundreds of years of religious warfare?
Hmm.
No, we wouldn't, but we certainly, if you were in those times, you might have wished to. And so you understand some of the conservative impulses, like the future is coming, as Alvin Toffler said, the future always comes too fast and in the wrong order.
Yeah. So, I mean, where do you see the kind of interesting people working on stuff that matters today? Are there sort of pockets that you've noticed in terms of people really, thinking maybe outside of that model that you've just been talking about?
Well, I mean, first off, I think there are people who are forced by necessity to work on stuff that matters, and it's not necessarily do good stuff. I mean, you look at, you know, Ukraine fighting for its survival, and they're pushing the future forward. Unfortunately, the future of warfare. I think there are people in some of the big companies. I do think that both DeepMind and Anthropic really, have very serious commitment to sort of using AI to try to, make advances in healthcare. And so, I don't think it's all dark, even at the big labs. I'm actually more jaundiced by, some of the smaller companies in Silicon Valley that are just jostling for their place at the trough. But,
Hmm.
but even there's always entrepreneurs who kind of are driven by, an impulse to serve a real audience. I don't think of AI or sort of technology for good as just do-gooders, although I do think there is a lot there. I mean, Jen started Code for America, started the United States Digital Service. Now she's sort of trying to work on government transformation. That sort of classic do-gooder arc, but with a very different, spin on what it is. But there are a lot of companies that do that. But I think of, for example, 11 Labs. When I talked to Matty, the founder, and he's just like, he and his co-founder were like, they're in Poland, and they're like, you don't realize in Poland, it's a small market, and the movies are just dubbed by one actor, all the voices, and we go, with AI, we could do better than that, and that's a kind of AI for good. That where they're just going like, there's an underserved market, and we could really make something better. And I do think that thread does run all through Silicon Valley, and its best work. It is somebody saying, "Wow, we could do better." But I think there's also what I'm seeing in a way that is AI is unlocking a kind of sort of bottom up community hacker innovation again that I've seen, was in the early web, it was in early open source, but it really kind of got wrung out of the system in the last decade before AI kind of blew things open again because there were more and more, the big companies really had everything locked down. And so, there's that, so a big part of AI for good is just turn people loose. And yes, there will be a lot of people chasing the money, but there will also be people who are just like curious, trying to solve problems, and
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting,
they've learned with others. And yeah,
one of the things I think we find really interesting is that AI enables people who really understand problems to build solutions.
that's right.
So you've got this like ability that actually almost, I think when we started working on this area, you'd have the people who understood the problems and then the engineers,
Right.
like kind of as separate camps almost. But now those two can be much closer together with AI, which is, well, I think is an interesting innovation moment where
Yeah,
you've got.
it is. I think there's an enormous opportunity for people who are close to problems to solve them. And I think that, the capability, I look at Jen's work, for example, with government, and you think about the bad version of AI. By the way, Henry Farrell has a great essay about this right now, about AI and Doge and the vision of AI as some kind of enabler of top-down control, which was embodied in Doge. And the vision of people like Jen, which is no, AI is an enabler of people who are trying to do the work. And so it's actually bottom up. If you can actually enable, in her case, she's looking at government. If you can enable people who are working in public service who really want to serve the public to give them new tools to do that better, that's really powerful. And she wrote a great piece about what she calls Horizon One, which is kind of the status quo, Horizon Two, which is sort of short term improvements, and then Horizon Three, which is really changing the status quo. And she says, look, a lot of the problem is that a lot of technology is just keeping the old status quo alive and not utterly transforming it. And I think that one of the interesting challenges in the AI for good space is to think big enough.
Yeah. And actually, one of the references you made in that original essay was to the Long Now Foundation.
Yeah.
And long-termism.
Mm-hmm.
Where is long-termism in the tech industry at the moment?
Yeah.
Has it disappeared, or what's your thinking about that
Well,
these days?
I don't think it's the tech industry that's the problem. It is literally the design of the entire system. Short-termism is baked in to our tax code. It's baked into all the ways that things are financed. We are not optimizing for human flourishing. We are optimizing for corporate profit, which goes to the holders of capital. And so the system is seriously out of balance. And so even people who are idealistic are locked into that system, which is why, I think, I've had a lot of talks with Eric Ries about this, who's written a new book called Incorruptible. Now she's just out. This is really about his ideas for long-term idealistic companies. I'm really admire what Eric's doing, and I think he's identified a lot of things that help. But I don't think the solutions are at the company or the entrepreneur or the individual level. They really are systemic. We literally have a system that demands that companies, basically do what we as human beings would consider to be the wrong thing.
And how do we go about changing that? Where do we point it?
I wish I knew, because I do think certainly there are steps that individual companies can take, but I think in some ways it's a social and cultural turning away from this crazy system. But I also, a lot of times I think in an odd way, the challenges of the 21st century are what are going to save us from ourselves. Because you look at climate change, you look at pandemics, you look at mass migrations, all of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that are coming at us sometime in this century, and we will have to stop playing games. We will have to get serious in the way that the people of Ukraine got serious with their crisis. Again, it's not pretty. It's not what you normally think of as we're doing good, but like doing good is solving the problems that you have to solve in order to flourish. And I do think that there are, first of all, there are a lot of people who are already working on this. And I love a great quote from Richard Rogers. He was always trying to reassure kids, and I forget what there was had been some disaster, and he had this show where he said, whenever there are bad things happening, look around for the people who are helping. There are always people who are helping. And it's just such a heartwarming message, and I look at people who are, working really hard on this energy transition, and, getting slammed down again and again. My son-in-law, Saul Griffith, has done huge amount on, electrification and energy, and, had a whole, company. And then, in comes the Trump administration, all the government grants get pulled, Rewiring America, all the grants get pulled, and it's just, it's really disheartening, but like, wow. And that goes back to that original talk I gave at eTech in 2007, where I ended with this poem by Rilke, where he said, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively by successively greater beings. He was talking about Jacob and the wrestlers of the Old Testament who would go out and wrestle with angels who they knew they could not defeat. And they would come away stronger from the fight. That's why he says successively greater beings, not just successively greater things. But, and I look around and I see that there are people who are, fighting with, wrestling with angels, and we are going to be building a very, very different world. And I think one of the things that I learned, maybe reading a lot of science fiction, some people read science fiction and they got, Terminator fantasies. And I read a lot of science fiction, and I got transformation fantasies, that like future world could be very different from the past. And I look at this a lot of, it's not a simple equation. One of my favorite books is a book called The Passions and the Interests by Alberto. And the subtitle says it all: Arguments for Markets Before Their Ascendants. Yeah, he goes back before Adam Smith and looks at all the early people. And the title of the book comes from the idea that the self-interest of merchants would be a gentler master than the passions of princes,
Hmm.
which was the idea that they had at the time. And of course, what happened was the merchants became princes, and then you got both the passions and the, which of course is what it was before, just a different. But you have this period of idealism. We had a period of idealism with the internet, and it took us a long way, and it got some really good stuff before it got corrupted.
Hmm.
Idealism around AI, and it's going to take us in some good directions, and then we'll get, and it's just, you just have to keep, fighting the good fight.
Yeah. No, I mean, we work with a lot of like really early stage founders who are maybe close to the problem, and trying to build a business, because to some extent that's the tools they have these days. You sort of what advice would you have for them these days? What's the how should they think about working on stuff that matters these days?
Well, I think first part of it is you're already doing it if you're looking for problems to solve. When I think about this whole question of AI taking all the jobs, I go, wait, look around. There's so much more to do. As long as we're trying to do more and make things better for people. I think Nick Hanna recalls, he said, technology is the solution to human problems. And that's really progress, right? So look for human problems and solve them. And if you're doing that, then as I famously said, it's probably my most famous quote, is, money is in a business is like gas in a car. You have to stop at gas stations, but you're not going on a tour of gas stations. And I feel like, as long as you're focused on your mission, and you do have to learn how to run a real business. And I do think that there are certainly, people who are focused on a mission, but who have not figured out how to get, product market fit, where
That's important.
people are able to pay for it, or that match the cost structure of the business to deliver the thing that that you are envisioning. And you have to solve those kinds of problems. And I think that you also have to realize that when the world changes, there may be, right now we're in the middle of huge um, uh, cross currents that can, wipe out somebody who's otherwise very successful and well-meaning and trying to do the best thing. And so I guess we need to hold it all lightly, and uh, I'm full of quotes. Another one that I love is from a poem by W.S. Merwin, where he says, "We were not born to survive, merely to live."
Yeah, that's great.
Businesses too, and we engage with a problem. We try to make things better. We do our best. And at some point, we're going to be, at some point, but what I want to say to all these people who are just sort of so obsessed with increasing their wealth, they go, what's going to happen when you come to the end of your life? How are you going to feel about that?
Yeah. Well, Tim, I think we should end it there. Let's leave it with that question. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been super interesting. And so, yeah, thanks so much, Tim. If you're listening and have suggestions for guests or topics, do get in touch. And if you're building a tech for good startup and looking for early stage investment, you can learn more about Bethnal Green Ventures at bethnalgreenventures.com. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.